Hello and welcome to this edition of Hold's Thought Leadership webinar series, where we explore the hottest topics affecting society and business today. For those who are joining at Hold, even for the first time, I just want to give you a little bit of background about us. Hold have designed a school that looks to the future by focusing on developing your leadership skills, challenging you with an experience and a future-oriented curriculum, and building a global perspective. So we currently offer an undergrad program, 5 specialist 1-year master programs, and a 1-year global MBA, and of course, a uniquely flexible part-time executive MBA. More information on our programs can be found at our website. You can put hold.edu, and you can find everything there. This evening, we are joined by Hold Professor Bill Carney to explore one of this year's hottest topic, which is pricing strategy. Now, before we begin, I would like to do a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar will last approximately 1 hour in total, and we will have time for questions at the end. A recording of the webinar will also be sent to everyone after the event, and if you wish to ask any questions, please write it in the Q&A at the bottom right-hand corner. We will put these questions to Bill at the end, and he can answer them for you. And now I would like to hand over to the Professor Bill Carney, and he can introduce himself.
Thank you very much for the very short introduction. And first of all, good evening, everybody. I'm coming to you from Geneva in Switzerland. It's 6 o'clock, but it's already almost pitch black outside. So we're well into the days of winter here. It's a pleasure to join you. I've been invited to come and talk about one of my favorite topics in marketing, which is the whole issue of pricing. And there's a reason why I've called this presentation Pricing Magic, as I will hopefully be able to demonstrate over the next 20 or 30 minutes. If you have any questions, please feel free just to type them into the Q&A section. If I think that they are to some extent relevant to what I'm talking about at the moment, I'll try and address them right away. If not, then I will obviously get to them towards the end of the presentation. But please feel free to, if you want to add something or you'd like some feedback on something that I just said, please feel free to type it in. I'm following the Q&A, and I'll do my best to try and respond. So I think to get started, there's two basic principles that I want to put on the table, because both of them are extremely important when it comes to pricing strategy. The first one is the fact that the vast majority of people suffer from what we call loss aversion. In other words, we are much more frightened of losing what we already have than we are of getting something new. So if you think about that in a commercial standpoint, it means that trying to get the money from someone's pocket and to get them to transfer that money into the purchase of a service or a product that you are bringing to the market, to some extent, you're pushing the stone uphill already, because of the natural inclination for most people is to try and hang on to what they have. So that suggests that obviously in your pricing strategies, you're going to have to think about being able to generate some idea of perceived value. I'll get back to that notion of perceived value in just a moment, that people are going to be willing to pay for. Okay, so that's really fact number one, and that's been demonstrated through recent research by Daniel Kahneman and Ariely and Tversky and others who've basically given us a fair amount of insight on the whole mechanics of pricing through their work in behavioral economics. The second issue that I want to put forward is the fact that the vast majority of customers have no idea what it actually costs to manufacture a product. I mean, if those of you, if you've got your phone in your hand or your tablet in your hand, ask yourself, do you actually know how much Samsung or Apple or Huawei or whatever company you might happen to be holding on to, what it actually costs them to make that, what, $700,000, $800,000 device that you're holding in your hand? Now, if that is the case, because we don't know what the cost is, and we don't like to be, when I say we, I mean us as human beings, since we don't like to be in a state of uncertainty, we will find some reference point against which we will establish a perceived value. I'll get back into this in a little more detail, but the bottom line is two things I want you to remember is that one, people are highly averse to loss, and two, most people don't know what it actually costs to manufacture a product, and therefore they will use some other information or reference point to develop their idea of what they believe is a fair price. And if I can get my technology working here, okay? Another key idea with pricing was discovered by a Swiss researcher by the name of Bernoulli, who's also known for hard drives, but that's a whole nother story. And his discovery that the value of money is relative. And I think many of us intuitively know this, but I think don't realize to what extent this is often applied in a marketing context. A very simple example is if you have $100 to get through the week, and for a lot of people, that's already a lot of money. If you have $100 to get through the week, spending $25 or $35 on a single meal might be something that you might hesitate to do, hesitate to do or think twice about. On the other hand, if you've got $1,000 to spend over that week or budgeted for that week, perhaps a $25 or $35 meal suddenly no longer appeals to be as expensive, even though the nominal amount, $25 or $35, remains the same. And this is something that we need to hang on to, because if that is true, that means that the perceived value of a good to a given individual or a given target customer can be significantly different based upon obviously things like their socioeconomic status and perhaps more specifically their income level. So, and we see this notion of the value of money being relative through a number of pricing strategies, some of which I'll talk about in just a few moments. It's also related to something else that you see in the slide, which we fondly call the power curve. In other words, we do not expect that a $40,000 car is going to give us twice as much as a $20,000 car, and indeed it doesn't. And if the higher you go, indeed it could be argued that you hit the law of diminishing returns, that yes, there is some improvement, but the improvement related to the amount of money spent tends to be perhaps smaller at the top end of many markets than it is in the middle or the lower end of many markets. And we call that phenomena the power curve. And if you relate the power curve to Bernoulli's discovery of the value of money being relative, I think you can put the two together and see that leaves some leeway for those of us fairly creative marketers to come up with some very interesting pricing strategies. Another issue is what we refer to as the power of the anchor. When we don't know something, and perhaps I need to jump back a little bit, most of the things that we know, or at least that we think we know, are based upon associations with other things. In other words, we learn by associating something that just happened with something that something that occurred in the past, and then by the difference in the behavior or whatever, we learn something new, or we see that what we just went through is something that is a repetitive type of behavior. That's called an anchor. We need an anchor for everything. And by shifting the anchor or providing an anchor for customers, we can steer, in many instances, the customer's behavior. Let me give you an example. Often when you see an ad for a car, that car will be associated to or parked next to a very expensive house. The notion being that, well, if the house is expensive, therefore the car must be expensive. And so automatically you're adjusting your expectations before you even heard what the price of the car is. Another example of anchoring is one that's often used in restaurants where, say, a medium to, I don't want to insult any restaurants, but let's say a medium quality restaurant will put very expensive wine glasses on the table. And that is so that when people come in and they see the glasses, or the people walking by, when they see the very expensive glasses, they say to themselves, the price of the food must be more or less in line with the very expensive glasses, therefore, quote unquote, somewhat expensive. And therefore, they will not be surprised when they come into the restaurant and they see perhaps a higher price than one might have normally expected from an establishment such as the one that they just walked into. Again, that relates back to Bernoulli's finding of the value of money being relative, depending on who you're talking to. And bottom line, what all of this means is that there are no absolutes. There are only contrasts and comparisons. And for us marketers, what that means is that we can have a field day because we can offer you an anchor for a given product or service, get you to expect a certain level of price, which we will then obviously deliver, because conditioning your responses and conditioning your expectations is part of what we do in marketing in the first place. Okay, so if you will, pricing is one of the areas where we see often a direct application of psychology and behavioral economics. Okay. One of the things also that I think if you don't know, I'll just remind you, which is that 95% of all cognition, in other words, everything that we think about, everything that we know, is occurring at the level of the subconscious. All right. So what that means is that we are not even aware of the vast majority of the things that we are seeing, experiencing, feeling, talking about, whatever. Okay. And what that means is that a lot of decisions that we think we're making consciously have already been made unconsciously, and the conscious part is really just the expression of a decision that has already been made. And this is one of the reasons why the studies of behavioral economics in recent years have lent so much to pricing and pricing theory, because it's helped us understand a number of different biases that customers have naturally built into them as human beings, which we can then take into consideration and to some extent try and influence in terms of how we apply them in pricing strategy. As you can see from the quote at the bottom here, your idea of what an item should cost is influenced by advertising prices, even when they are totally unbelievable, because what we're doing is we're giving you another anchor. And the fact of the matter is if we repeat that anchor often enough, okay, and that's what was referred to in the earlier slide as recency and duration. If we repeat that often enough, you will begin to accept that as a new standard, okay? And once you've accepted that as a new standard, that becomes the anchor to which everything else is compared. One of the areas where we see this, for example, is in the watch business or even in the car business. Let's talk about the watch business, where a particular Swiss brand is famous for making a watch that costs $3.6 million. They don't expect to sell a lot of them. Indeed, they do not sell a lot of them. But what happens is when they show a customer that particular watch, and then they show a wealthy customer another watch that is only $450,000, the one for $450,000 actually appears cheap compared to the one that was $3.6 million. It could also be argued that perhaps this is one of the other reasons that the Volkswagen groups has subsidized the Bugatti nameplate for so long, because having a car that sells at the price of the Bugatti Veyron, or I believe the other one's called the Chiara, but at the price of the Veyron makes the price of an upmarket Audi look downright inexpensive. Okay, so, and because everything's based upon those comparisons, we use these comparisons as a way of trying to influence how people feel about whether or not a price is fair or not. Now, perhaps one of the things I need to mention here is that so far, much of what I've been saying about pricing is more related to a B2C or business to consumer context, than it is to a B2B concept. That doesn't mean it's not valid in B2B, but I would argue that it's probably valid to a slightly lesser extent simply because of the nature of the relationship between B2B partners, which tends to be extremely close, so close that very often they know each other's cost structures. They have a pretty clear idea of what their suppliers' profitability is on many of the components and parts that they're selling them. So we have, if you will, less flexibility in terms of our ability to influence customers' perceptions of pricing. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that companies cannot influence people in B2B. Gary Lillian's work at MIT a number of years back through the advisor studies already demonstrated very clearly that even in B2B, your reception and your pricing would be and could be influenced by the reputation that your company had, everything else being equal. So it's pretty clear that even within a B2B scenario, some of the levers that we use in pricing are valid, although perhaps not as omnipresent, let's put it that way, as we tend to see them in a business to consumer type setting. One of the reasons that pricing is such an important issue is that it influences so many other things within the business, okay? Obviously, your company is going to have financial objectives. You want to make X amount or X percent on your money invested by the end of the year. So to some extent, your price is going to link your ability to make those financial objectives through the sale of your product. So what we like to say is that, there's a direct link between your marketing actions, i.e. your pricing strategy, and your ability to achieve your financial objectives. On another line, your price level is also going to determine your sales potential. Depending on what your price level is, high, medium, low, whatever the case may be, that may encourage or discourage certain customers from doing business with you, and in so doing, influence your market share. Okay, your pricing also tends to position your firm vis-a-vis its competitors, right? If you think of Mercedes versus Toyota, I think it's safe to say you come away with two very different ideas, which is, maybe perhaps one of the reasons Toyota wanted to create Lexus, so that they could try and get a pricing premium closer to what Mercedes gets. And that's a whole nother discussion of, does anybody really know how much it costs to make a Mercedes versus how much you're going to pay for it, okay? So basically, it can be argued that your pricing is going to influence your trade margins, how much money you have for, in distribution. It's going to influence your profit margins. It's going to influence your return on investment. And through the influence in your return on investment, it's going to influence the money that you have to spend on advertising, the money that you have to spend on investing in new plant and equipment. In other words, your pricing is going to have a huge influence on a lot of different aspects of your business. And unfortunately, research suggests that this is one of the areas that many marketing people dislike the most, simply because pricing is a flexible concept. It's very hard to define precisely, and the nature of pricing dynamics can vary significantly from one industry to another. The nature of pricing dynamics, for example, in the oil industry, where I've dabbled on occasion, is very different from the nature of pricing dynamics in the clothing industry, which is another industry where I have spent some time, okay? So it's very difficult to kind of just give you a broad brush definition of pricing beyond some of the things that I'm talking about here, okay? You also have a scenario where different segments consuming the same product might be liable to paying different or open to paying different price levels. Take for example, people traveling on an airliner, sitting in the same row, and all 5 or 6 of those people could very easily have paid different prices for their tickets online. That's a great example. And I see some questions are starting to come in here. Let me just hold on to that question just for a moment, if I may, and let me just try and mention a couple of quick points here. So the bottom line is that what's going on is that your pricing is going to interact with all of the other elements of the marketing mix and have a direct impact on them. It also defines the value of the buyer-seller relationship. You have all, I'm sure, bought something from a supplier, a store or whatever, or online perhaps, at a price higher than you could have paid somewhere else. So in other words, you were driven by something other than just the price. This is what we mean by it defines the value of the buyer-seller relationship, because if you were willing to pay a higher price, that means that there was something there, maybe it was convenience, whatever it might have been, that suggested that to you, it was worth that extra dollar, those few extra dollars, those few extra euros, those few extra dirhams, whatever the situation might have been, okay? Also, for those of you who have already had some classes in business, or for those of you contemplating taking classes in business, there's a concept known as the product life cycle, which is widely used by companies for managing their products over time. And pricing and the knowledge of how customers will behave at given times of the market is also extremely important and instrumental in helping companies determine the individual prices for the products that they're going to sell. And I see a quick question from someone asking me to explain the power curve. Yes, the power curve is a very general concept. Let me try and illustrate it in another way. I happen to be a hi-fi freak. Okay, I love listening to music from high quality sources. Right. A 20-watt amplifier, for example, in many cases will be enough to play music from most small speakers. Okay. If you get a 100-watt amplifier, it's not going to sound 5 times louder than the 20-watt, and it's not going to sound 5 times better than the 20-watt either, unless you spent a heck of a lot of money. In other words, it's not a linear extrapolation, okay? In other words, we hit the law of diminishing returns. In other words, the more you pay, in some cases, the less you can expect to get for it. I hope I'm communicating this clearly. It's kind of a delicate point to get across, but nobody buying a Porsche expects it of necessity to go 2 or 3 times, or forget that, maybe 4 or 5 times the speed of a Golf GTI, which is also a relatively fast car, even though the Porsche may cost 5 times or 400 or 500% what you would have paid for the Golf. Okay, that's the notion of the power curve, and I hope I was a little better at explaining it this particular time around. That's a very good question, Carolina. So one of the things to remember is that the purpose of pricing is not to recover costs. And one of the things that often happens is we say to ourselves, okay, I got to get my costs back. But that's really not what we want to do. I believe in value-based pricing. In other words, understanding before you set the price, understanding what a given product or service is worth to a customer, and then setting the price accordingly. But, perhaps a striking example is someone in the middle of the Sahara Desert dying of thirst, or perhaps just extremely thirsty, might be willing to pay a higher price for a bottle of clean water, perhaps than someone in the streets of Geneva or the streets of Paris or the streets of Boston or something like that, simply because the perceived value of that product is higher. And when you get into a scenario like that, you'll discover that many companies will actually price their products based upon perceived value, which doesn't necessarily have anything to do with cost, but basically what I think it's worth to you. Here's a great example that I often like to use. I live here in Switzerland, and a Big Mac last year was around $6.50 here in Geneva, which is, for those of you who might be in the States, is just a crazy price. But anyway, was around $6.50, whereas the same Big Mac in the Ukraine was only $1.95. Okay. And for all intents and purposes, an identical product. Now, as you can read from the slide, McDonald's will give you all types of justifications as to why this is the case. But one of the key determinants is the fact that here in Switzerland, people have a much higher both disposable and discretionary income. And remember the importance of money being relative. So therefore, it could be argued that maybe $6.50 to someone on a Swiss income is equivalent to, psychologically speaking, to $1.95 in the pocket of someone in the Ukraine. I hope I explain that clearly. And McDonald's understands this and obviously tries to take advantage of this in the numerous markets in the world where they operate. And that's just one example. So clearly, what we have is a rather simple equation if you think about it, right? If you're looking at the slide, if your cost is on the far left side, your price is in the middle, and the perceived value is on the far right, customers are going to probably say to themselves, that's a really good deal. I think it's worth more than what they're charging. In other words, the perceived value is higher than the price. Second case scenario, where you have your cost on the left, the value in the middle, and the price in the far right, that's an uncomfortable situation. Customer says, hey, look, I think this is worth 20, but you're asking 60 for it. It's overpriced. I'm not going to buy it. Third case scenario, which is the value is on the far left, the cost is in the middle, and the price is on the far right. That's a losing proposition. Obviously, I think anybody thinking that through will see that. Yet, I put it up here because in my years of working with companies, I have seen companies do this for various reasons, which I won't get into given the brevity of time here we have for this presentation. But I do put it up there because even though it might seem eminently idiotic, perhaps, it nonetheless does occur. The ideal scenario is the last one, which is where you have your cost on the far left and your price is equivalent to the perceived value that someone is willing to pay. Now, notice the emphasis on the word perceived, because we can influence how people perceive a given item, and this is one of the purposes of advertising and marketing communications, is to kind of shape and try and condition people's perceptions of our products before, in many cases, before they have an opportunity even to interact directly with the product. And obviously, that type of thinking has clear implications for pricing. Some of the things you need to think about, which are perhaps some of the more tricky aspects, if you will, of pricing, is the whole concept of price elasticity, which is, how far can I push up a price before my demand drops significantly, right? Or alternatively, how far do I need to lower the price to see demand increase significantly? That's a notion of what we call pricing elasticity. Certain products tend to be highly inelastic. In other words, even if you kick the price up, it doesn't affect demand significantly. Other products are highly elastic, where just a slight change can prompt a customer to shift to a substitute product. Okay, and so you see some of the things, some of the other drivers there are switching costs, both to and from your product. The issue of pricing transparency. Obviously, if customers in different segments or in different perhaps parts of the world know that your product is available at a certain price, they will shift their purchasing to that particular area of the world. This is something that we've been seeing on an increasing basis as markets become more international and more transparent, thanks to the internet. So we need to think about pricing transparency. And in some cases, particularly when you're selling services or software, you also need to think about the cost of serving the customer and training that customer, which should be built into your price going in. Once you've already sold the product or the software in, it becomes a little more difficult to then go back and try and sell additional services immediately behind that, because the customer often has the impression that they're being taken advantage of. Okay. The clock is ticking here, and I think I've come to what is probably my last slide before I try and take one or two of the questions that I've got here. In many markets, we have different levels of pricing. And indeed, in some markets, you will have companies that specialize in certain price levels. So for example, here in Europe, there's a supermarket chain called Lidl, L-I-D-L, which is known as a discount chain. In the United States, we have Dollar General or Dollar More or Dollar Tree, which are companies which actually are growing extremely rapidly at the moment, which tend to sell products around $1. And that's really their stock and trade. People go there because they know it's going to be very inexpensive, and they might be lucky enough to get some branded products as well. So we have everything from kind of at one extreme, the price alone company that basically says, I'm going to sell based on price. And the only company that can really do this sustainably, I believe, is the cost leader, because obviously if you're leading on cost, you're always making either more money or losing less money at a given price level than your competitors. So being cost leader is clearly an advantage. And this is one of the reasons why you often see so many companies struggling and fighting so hard to get costs out of the system so that they can try and achieve that cost leadership position. And then at the other end, you have the extreme where, this is what we call the bespoke market, where products are not off the rack, where they're made individually, whether it's a bespoke suit that will set you back several tens of thousands of dollars, or a bespoke piece of jewelry from Graf that will set you back several hundreds of thousands of dollars. To some extent, that's the other extreme of the market. And then you have a number of different price levels in between: luxury, special needs, ease and convenience. Ease and convenience, I think, is an easy one for most folks to understand. That's why your liter of milk or your gallon of milk costs more at the 7-Eleven or the gas station than it does at the supermarket, is because they know the supermarket's either 5 miles away or closed at 11 o'clock at night when you want to have that cereal. And so therefore they charge you a slight premium for that. So very briefly, what I've tried to get across in this little bit of time that we have together is number one, the psychological aspects of pricing. And that is due to the fact, as I stated up front, that most customers really don't know what it costs to make a product, and therefore the cost is not a reference when it comes to their determining whether a price is fair or not, which means that we as marketers have a huge opportunity to influence and condition to some extent how customers will feel about our products and services even before they have a chance to interact with us. let's see, some examples are products with a high elasticity and lowest elasticity. Okay, it could be argued that to some extent petrol is inelastic, right? I'm old enough to have watched the price of petrol increase significantly over the course of a couple of decades, and in many cases that has not significantly altered consumption. We've adjusted to it. Okay, so the fact that you have gas here at $7 a gallon, whereas in the United States it's maybe $2.60 or $2.70 a gallon. Yes, Americans do tend to drive more, but and another one is coffee. As you've probably noticed with Starbucks and others, you know, we've now pushed the price of a cup of coffee that somebody is willing to pay $5, $6, $7. So very, very, very clearly, to some extent, the only limit on the price of a cup of coffee is what I can make you believe that it's worth. Okay, so those would be products that would be perhaps relatively inelastic. A product that would be very elastic would be something whereby increasing the price significantly causes your demand to fall through the floor. Just right now off the top of my head, I can't think of one that would exemplify that. But well, I didn't want to go there, but some companies have a policy of launching a product at a relatively high price, and then over the life cycle of the price of the product, the price will slowly but surely come down over time. If you look at the video game business, for example, that's one of the things that they do in the video game business, and that is a direct function of the elasticity of the product at a given period of release time. I think that might be a fairly good example to answer that question, Eva. Eva. I hope that's at least a partial answer to your question. I don't have any other questions here that I haven't addressed in my remarks already. Are there any other questions, or is there anything coming up in the chat box that I haven't seen?
Hey, Bill, so they have some questions in the chat box.
Okay, can you
read it to you? So one is from Sean.
Okay.
He's asking if this does not create a bad ethical outlook for these companies who are changing a great amount for their products.
Okay. Yeah, there's that's a very good question. In other words, is it unethical for Prada to charge $8,000 for a dress? Okay, or is it unethical for Bottega Veneta to charge even more, let's say $32,000 for a woman's handbag? You know, this is a really difficult question to answer, simply because depending on where you are and who you are, different people have different ethics. Okay, some people believe that, you know, spending $100 for a pair of sneakers is absolutely ridiculous, whereas we have other people at the other extreme who are happily paying $700, $800, $2,000 for sneakers from Louis Vuitton or Prada. And is there anything unethical about it? Well, are they hurting anyone? No. Perhaps the issue that the person who asked the question is actually digging at is perhaps a little bit deeper than that, which is the system structured appropriately so that people have more or less equal access to all of the wonderful things that this planet has to offer? And I think that we already know the answer to that particular question. And there's not a whole lot that me as a marketer that I can do about it. But it is true. There is an ethical issue that is related to pricing. Let me just give you an example. I spent some time working for a company whose products are sold widely all over the world. It's one of the world's strongest brands. I don't want to mention the brand name here. I didn't come here to do any advertising. And what I noticed is that this company's brand was so strong is that consumers would even buy a product that looked the same, right? But would put it into one of this company's packages because they wanted people to believe that the product that they were using was the one from this particular company rather than the least expensive product that they had actually put inside the packaging. So, you know, the gentleman who asked the question, I believe it was a gentleman who asked the question, puts his finger on an extremely delicate issue, particularly at the moment, with a lot of millennials who are questioning not just the ethics, but also perhaps the validity and approach that has been used by the discipline of marketing over the last, say, 40 or 50 years as the discipline has really come into its own. And I think there's some meat on that particular bone that's worth chewing on, indeed. I'm not sure whether that was hopefully at least a partial answer to the question. Was there anything else in the chat room?
Yes, they have in the Q&A. George, he's asking about any additional materials that you would recommend to know more about psychology of pricing.
Yes, there's probably one of my favorite books, which is called The Psychology, if I remember correctly, it's called The Psychology of Influence. And it's by Robert Cialdini. And I just want to really double check that because I usually have the book right here next to me. So hang on, bear with me just a moment. I believe it's called, I just want to make sure I give you the right title. The gentleman's name is Robert Cialdini. He's probably recognized as the guru of manipulation or influence, if you will, which is an area that I've spent a fair amount of time studying as well. I'm just trying to see where the heck is that. But yes, I believe it's called The Psychology of Influence. No, excuse me. It's called Influence, The Psychology of Persuasion. I knew I had it wrong. The Psychology of Persuasion. That is probably one of the best books to get started with. And if you look at some of the bibliography that he provides in his books, I think that will lead you down the rabbit hole that many of us jumped into some years back and are still struggling to find an exit.
Thank you, Bill. There's also a question about what is the idea behind perspective pricing? It is a major factor in determining the price of a product.
I'm not sure I understand what this person means by perspective pricing. So I hesitate to answer. It's not a term that I am immediately familiar with, but that doesn't mean anything because there's a lot of marketing terms that I'm not immediately familiar with. So unfortunately, if Olaoluwa can perhaps give me a little bit more background on that, and I'll see if I can provide a little more feedback on that.
Okay. In the meantime, if you want to give them a little bit of like time to elaborate on that, there's another question.
Okay.
So Juan, he's asking, what do you recommend to give a new product in the market? Like, what is the best strategy?
What is the best strategy for setting a price for a product in the market?
For a new product in the market.
For a new product in the market. Okay. Well, there's a couple of things that actually you're going to need to do. And I have basically an outline that I can send them, but basically if I try and remember all of the individual steps, it starts with identifying the target market, okay? So one is, who is it that you want to sell to, right? Because everything is going to flow from there, okay? Second, you're going to need to estimate the total level of demand for the product, okay? And then estimate the percentage of that demand that you think that you can take, okay? So those are kind of three key exercises that need to be done at the very beginning. You also then need to, based upon that, to take a look at your break-even point to see whether the potential volume that you believe that you can take is going to be enough for you to be profitable, not just to break even, but also to be profitable. In other words, it's going to help you set a number, a numerical target that your salespeople and yourself will work towards in order to achieve the financial objectives. You're then going to have to do a quick little SWOT and look at what's going on with your competitors in the market, right? Because unless you're the only one with something that everyone needs, there's generally always some type of competition, and that competition is going to, in some cases, influence the ceiling, or perhaps in some cases, the price floor that you're able to get for your product. Take a look at then, go through the other elements of the marketing mix. So starting with your product, think about, what is the level of quality that you want to have in the product, because there may be a direct link between the quality of the product and your price. Think about how you want to distribute the product. How are you going to get it to your customers? Because selling online has perhaps one cost structure, whereas going through retail brick and mortar outlets have yet another structure. Think about how you're going to let your potential customers know that your product is there, and how much is that going to cost you, okay? Once you've done those exercises, which are the other elements of the marketing mix, then you know what are some of the additional cost factors that you're going to have to add to your costs to be able to make sure that you come out of this thing with a few extra dollars in your pocket, right? That is, I think, basically a very quick and dirty approach to how to set a price. If that individual wants to drop me an email, I have a chart that I can send him or her that will outline fairly specifically what are the 9 or 10 steps that you need to go through in terms of how you set your price. I think I've given you probably the most important ones, but there's probably 1 or 2 steps that I may have glossed over that the model would go through in a little more detail.
Thank you so much, Bill.
My pleasure.
There's more questions. You want me to tell it to you?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, let's go.
So Gabriela, she says that you mentioned brands that have a high price, but they have a lower value than the actual price. And she believes that the FMCG brands, that means that the fast-moving consumer goods brands, they have a high-low price strategy to drive strong saving messages. And she's asking if you believe that this has changed consumers' mentality when considering to purchase a product.
I think that, boy, that's a really big question, because it's very difficult for me to give a blanket answer, because there are significant differences in product categories. But let me try and get to the heart of the issue here, which is I hope where she's going, and she can perhaps correct it on the chat room if I'm going in the wrong direction. About a year ago, I had a chance to meet the chief marketing officer for Virgin, Richard Branson's company. And we were talking about marketing, and particularly marketing to millennials, which is a challenge for many companies these days. And one of the things that the gentleman said was, he says, the problem that we're having with these folks is that they were born with, excuse the language here, I don't mean to offend anybody, is that these people were born with built-in bullshit detectors. In other words, it's very difficult to pull the wool over their eyes. And a lot of the tricks that we used to be able to do back in the 60s and 70s, and even to some extent in the 80s, this won't fly anymore, simply because I think, as the young lady who asked the question is suggesting, consumer attitudes have changed. Yes, they have. If you walk down Fifth Avenue in New York City, you'll see that many of the flagship brands like Ralph Lauren, for example, they've had to close their stores simply because the power of the brand is no longer enough for somebody to justify a trip to the store. If they can buy it online, they'll buy it online. And in some cases, if they can get a counterfeit version from China, so much the better. So I think if the issue that the young lady, I think, was trying to put her finger on is there an increased sensitivity to pricing strategies of companies and their attempts to perhaps extract more value from products than some would say is deserved? I think that yes, I think that she's right on target. And I think the millennials have already signaled this to a large number of brands simply by just slowing their purchases of those products. Okay. So yes, I think there has been a certain amount of a retraction. Now, you notice, like I mentioned, the millennials, because coming behind the millennials, obviously now we got the Gen Zs and whatever, and their profile in many respects is more like, oh boy, I'm gonna get myself in trouble here, but I'm gonna say it anyway, is in many respects more like those of the baby boomers than it is of the millennials. In other words, millennials wanted experiences, whereas it looks like the Gen Zs, they want things. They don't want to share a car. They want to own a car. They don't want the experience of doing something. They want that something in their garage. They want that something in their bedroom. So we have, again, every generation has its own taste as the market evolves. But to try and put a quick answer to the lady's question is there increased customer sensitivity to company brand strategies and their attempts to leverage increased profitability? Yes, there is increased sensitivity, and in some cases there has been a pushback. Yeah, absolutely. Just perhaps another note on that. Is fully 75% of all the clothing, of all of the apparel that's now bought in the United States is bought through what we call off-price outlets. In other words, all the branded manufacturers, the Gaps of the world, the Armanis of the world, all of these people are competing for only 25% of the market, it could be argued, right? Until their stuff obviously then finds its way into the outlets or whatever the case may be, right? So it is very clear that some of the brands have indeed lost a fair amount of power in recent years, no question. Yes. Yes.
Thank you for your answer, Bill.
My pleasure.
We have another one that's from Shay. She would like to know how global companies are building their pricing strategy in non-democratic states or no free markets.
Okay. That's a loaded question because the use of the word democratic or non-free markets. What I'm going to assume by that is that the ability to own and operate a business is not just dependent upon your ability, but upon the willingness of perhaps the sheikh in a given country or the president in a given country, giving you the rights to exploit or develop a given business sector. In those types of scenarios, what often happens is those people wind up with a virtual monopoly. And whenever you have a monopoly, there's obviously an incentive to maximize profit, simply because your customers have no other choice. This is perhaps one of the reasons why Africans pay, at the moment, some of the highest tariffs for telephony and message sending, simply because there isn't a great deal of what I would call really honest competition in a lot of the countries, and as a result, the consumer is penalized, whereas the companies are milking some very interesting profits. So I hope that's at least a partial answer to that question, is that the use of the word democracy and non-free, one could be talking about, some people would say, for example, that the Saudi Arabian market is not a free market because you require a Saudi partner, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then we have the same type of scenario to some extent in the US as well, perhaps just what's obvious.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for providing that answer. Lastly, so there's one more question.
Sure.
This person is based in Iran.
Okay.
He's asking, because of all the transactions towards Iran, industries change their final price every now and then.
Yep.
And even though there's no significant relation between some of the industries within the US dollar price, the businesses sometimes determine the price, and it is necessary to change it every time we have some loss in our currency. He's kind of like asking how it is justified that they do this, if it's necessary to change it every time they have loss in their currency.
Okay. This is a really, really, really good question. And it's a sensitive question because there's obviously a commercial angle to this, but there's also a social and political angle to this. So let's talk about first the commercial side of it. If I'm a European company, let's say I'm a Swiss company. If I'm a Swiss company, I'm doing business in Swiss francs. And if I sell to a company in Iran at a given price in, let's say, in Iranian currency, and that currency then is devalued on the market for various political or monetary reasons, that means that when I actually get paid my money in Iranian currency, I may have to take a loss because the difference in the fluctuation of the currency might be large enough that that actual transaction is no longer profitable for me. What many companies will do in a scenario like that is they will hedge. They'll go to a bank and they'll buy a hedging contract, which allows them to some extent to try and protect their losses. Now, is this normal for a company to do so? I hate to say it to some extent, but the answer is yes, because the purpose of a company is to operate and to generate an acceptable level of profit for its stakeholders. And it's very difficult to generate an acceptable level of profit when you're losing money in given markets. So one of either two things will happen is you will adjust your pricing accordingly to make sure that your level of profitability is what you expected, or you will stop selling to that market. Now, another thing that happens often in a scenario like that is because of currency fluctuations, if they are severe, the risk profile then of doing business in that company also tends to increase, and therefore the interest rates that people will charge for lending people doing business in those countries is also going to go higher. So there is a clear relationship in many cases, particularly when we're talking large business to business or capital goods types of purchases, you know, airplanes or Caterpillar type equipment and stuff like this, where, you know, there's tens of millions of dollars involved in these transactions. A fluctuation in the currency, you know, if a company is trading on relatively thin margins, can literally wipe out your profitability. So it is not unusual to see numerous price adjustments in unstable environments. Let's put it that way, whether it's Iran, Venezuela, or even the United States back in 2008, for example. Okay. I hope that's at least a partial answer to the question.
Well, we have the last question.
Okay.
And yeah, because we're almost at 6 p.m. So the example of McDonald's that you gave for pricing differently in US versus Ukraine, is this kind of a strategy for consumer products? Similarly, many times it happens, especially in B2B for professional services industry, that for same services, companies would charge differently. And he's asking how sustainable this strategy is in a long run.
That's a very good question, and let me perhaps try and answer that from my own personal experience. A few years back, I had advertising agencies in Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, and Addis Ababa. So basically, Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia. And one of the issues that you run into in a scenario like that is I discovered, for example, we were executing a campaign for a customer in Ethiopia that required a fair amount of work, a fair amount of effort, a lot of creativity. And we were only able to charge $20,000 for that work because people at that time in Addis Ababa, and this is about 4 or 5 years ago, felt that was an outrageous amount of money to be spending on advertising. And that wasn't even on the advertising, it was just in the concept development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That a similar campaign, which I would have developed and have developed in the past for, let's say, a customer in the US, could easily have gone out the door at $200,000, right? So we're talking about significant differences in certain prices because of the perceived value of what you're offering, okay? The US is a highly commercial market, highly competitive. People understand the value of marketing communications within a scenario like that. The economy in Ethiopia is just beginning to emerge into something resembling a very vibrant type of not necessarily a completely free economy, but to a large extent a free economy. But nonetheless, income levels and I think perhaps also what companies are used to paying is just not the same. And so I reached a point where it just didn't make sense to me, not being a citizen of any of those three countries, to continue to expend that much effort when a similar amount of effort expended in another country was going to give me a greater return on my investment. right? So I think that is one of the issues that business people are constantly being faced with, which is in this day and age, businesses have the opportunity to deploy their capital or their resources in any one of a number of different places in the world, and capital is going to tend to go to where it finds a welcome home. You know, I remember an ambassador that I met years ago here in Geneva once saying that the truest test is to open the doors to capital flow, and if the money flows out, you know you're doing something wrong. And I think there's a certain amount of truth there. There's a certain amount of truth there, and that might have been a very long-winded answer to what I think he was hoping was a very simple question, but it was actually a rather complex question. So hopefully some input.
Thank you very much for that, Bill. That was really insightful. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. As we said before, a recording of the webinar will be sent out in the following email over the next few days. If you feel that this was useful and you're craving for more of this type of content, please make sure to visit our website. We have a number of other webinars coming on. And the next one, I think, is on January 21st with Silvia Vianello. So please go to the Hold website and check the event page, and you can have everything there to register. And that's all from us today. Thank you very much for the presentation, Bill.
My pleasure.
For joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thanks for checking in, folks. It's been a pleasure having an opportunity to share some ideas with you. Take care.